Finally, the construction has stopped, and I can actually start making this video because I've been dying to make more videos, but the construction on the side of my building is probably 8 feet away from my microphone. It is absolutely crazy, but finally, here we are analyzing a hand from the TRITON tournament series, and we find ourselves in a hand between Grandmaster Jason Koon and Rui Cao. Now, the camera cuts into the turn action, but as you can see, Jason Koon opened under the gun +1 in a 7-handed game with King 7 suited, which is probably going to be fairly standard, even though it's possible that he doesn't open this hand 100% of this time. And Rui defends with 10-9 suited, which is also going to be very standard considering he's facing a little bit more of a min-raise in an anti-structure game. Now, the first thing that I thought was interesting about this hand is that, as you can see from the action, after Rui checks, Koon actually goes ahead and pots the flop. How good is this pot size bet? Here, we see that after Rui checks 100% of his range, if we give the solver the option between a 100% bet and a 33% bet, it wildly prefers using the large bet size. So, likely because Jason is tight and under the gun and facing a very wide range from Rui's flat in the big blind, he's going to want to polarize a lot of the hands in his betting range and then go for the big size because he's going to have a very uncapped advantage. Here, in position, you can see that there are a lot of hands that have EVs that are enormous compared to the size of the pot. Out of a $432 pot, many of these hands hold 3/4 or have an EV more than 100% of the pot here. Often, when you have hands involving the under-the-gun player, you'll find that a lot of his hands really want to bet either very large or check, and that very rarely will his entire range want to bet a small percentage of the pot. However, if you do adjust this model and force the in-position player to bet 30% of the time, he'll make about $144.42 as opposed to $146.85 out of a $216 pot. So, as you can see, if you go ahead and depol this flop, it probably is not going to be a mistake in any EV sense. Facing a large bet, Rui should call most of his jacks, his 8s, his 4s, occasionally folding his 4s that have the worst backdoors or blockers, and re-raising only a small percentage of the time, even with a hand as strong as jacks or 8s. When your opponent pots it from under the gun and you have jacks, doesn't really seem to be much of a reason to raise. However, a hand like 4s is a lot more incentivized to raise because it unblocks your opponent from having hands like ace-jack or king-jack. Obviously, Rui's going to call with 100% of his combinations of 10-9, and with the turn comes the 6 of diamonds, we'll see that Rui should be checking 100% of his range. Here, when we look at the hotness comparison, we can see that the 6 of diamonds on the turn is not a very good card, but it's not the absolute worst card. That would obviously be an 8. Jacks are also pretty bad, but for the most part, aside from those problematic cards, the under-the-gun player is going to continue to barrel a lot, especially if the turn is an ace, a king, a 2, or a 3. After Rui checks, what hands should Koon continue firing on the turn? He should definitely blast most of his diamonds, most notably checking back when he has diamonds that have a little bit of showdown value, or diamonds that block your opponent from having a lot of open-ended straight draws and gut shots themselves. However, of say, heart-type hands, it seems that mostly gut shots continue firing, as well as some combinations of king-queen that block your opponent from having a lot of jack-x combinations. Obviously here you would wildly prefer betting the queen of diamonds over any other combination of queen, but to be honest, many of the under-the-gun's hands play pretty straightforwardly. Here, almost all of the combinations of king 7 except for king 7 of diamonds are going to be pretty standard checkbacks.
On the turn, to finally give him a little something, Rui Cao, second check with his open-ender that he flopped. Rui was a flat caller, defending against the 27K open.
So Jason Koon checks, and the river is the 8 of spades. Now, in the model, I've given Rui only a singular bet size, 33%. And as you can see, he should be pretty much betting the overwhelming majority of his range here. After Koon checks back the turn, and the river comes arguably one of the worst cards in the deck for him, Rui can just go ahead and blast almost all of his range.
Board pairs on the end, and K7-high knows it's unlikely to win at showdown.
And here, as you can see, King 7 is clearly going to be a call.
Peaches for chips.
However, you really don't want to bluff catch when you hold a queen, a 10, or a 9.
Koon with one of the better kings to call with, unblocking the 9-10, 9-queen, queen-10 situation,
which is going to block almost all of the open-ended straight draws and gut shots that your opponent is going to have on the flop. So as the in-game announcers correctly predict, calling with King 7 is vastly superior to calling with King 9 or King 10 here.
But is it enough? Like Jason deems that it is. Take it down, Mr. Koon. Be nice.
So Jason goes ahead and makes the call. However, things get a little bit more interesting once we use a subtree configuration and take a look at other possible lines that Rui can take. Here, if we build a subtree configuration and give Rui 2 possible bet sizes and rebuild this tree, first, you'll notice that by the time we get to this branch of the game tree, Rui should have a gigantic advantage as the out-of-position player. Again, because Koon checked back the turn, and the river came a card that really should help Rui with the 8 of spades. Here, if we look at the optimal strategy, you can see because Rui should have a hugely dominating advantage after he calls a pot-sized bet, the turn goes check-check, and the river comes really good for him, that he should almost always be sizing up, and if you give him the ability to shove all in here, he'll mostly be shoving in when he does bet. However, because this is an MTT and the value of not busting is much more important, I've taken away that option. However, this does illustrate that if Rui is using a large size and a small size, a lot of the hands that are put into Rui's small size are going to be the 6x type hands, the weak Jack-X, and a couple bluffs. But the 1/3 bet sizing is actually going to be full of a lot of hands that are betting and trying to extract really, really thin value. 6-3, etc., etc. So, if Rui uses this bet schema, if he bets large, Jason's going to have to fold the overwhelming majority of his range. However, if Rui bets small, Jason becomes a lot less incentivized to try to bluff catch with a hand like Ace-King or King-7, and it folds the majority of the time and calls or raises a couple hands for balance. So on the river, in Jason's shoes, if he thinks Rui is just betting 100% of his range, or close to it using the small bet size, then clearly King 7 suited is going to be a profitable snap. However, if Rui is putting all of his bluffs and his very strong hands into his large betting size, and then putting a mixture of a couple bluffs but more thin value hands in his small betting size, this wildly disincentivizes Jason from bluff catching, and makes him want to raise or fold when he does continue a little bit more often. So I thought this was a very interesting spot because 2 different equilibria gave 2 different solutions for Jason Koon. Obviously, Jason has a lot more experience playing against Rui than I do, so he's more likely to be aware of what kind of bet schema Rui is using here by the river. However, if your opponent is using mixed sizings, this does really illustrate how important it is to think about exactly what hands are being put in your opponent's mixed sizing range. This also demonstrates that if you use one sizing by the river, while your EV might not necessarily be much worse than using 2 sizings in this spot, playing 2 sizings seems to be much more annoying for your opponent to deal with. Though on the other hand, you are also increasing the complexity of your game as well. For example, if you bet 1/3 and your opponent shoves off on you, technically you need to be able to 3-bet on the river with a couple bluffs. And in real time, you might not find re-raises with Ace-9 offsuit or Ace-6 suited, and you'll accidentally wander into a spot where you are being exploited because you did not sufficiently study how to play after betting small on the river. Important things to think about. Thanks for watching. As always, please like and subscribe. And if you have any requests for other hands from the TRITON Tournament series, please send them my way. I'm always very happy to field requests. If you have questions about PIOsolver, poker coaching, slam poetry, send them my way. Hope to hear from you soon, and as always, good luck.
Okay, pal. I see what you're doing.